My husband accused me of cheating just for following my dreams. He never expected what I'd do next. We had been married for 16 years. That fact alone sometimes still staggered me. How much life fits into 16 years? When you say it out loud, it sounds like a number you toss into casual conversation. Oh, we've been married 16 years. But living through it day by day reveals how much happens, how much changes, how many unexpected corners you turn. And in my case, how someone you've known forever can suddenly feel like a stranger. My name is Rachel, and my husband, ex-husband now, let's call him Mark. Together, we have two children, both of whom came into our lives in those swirling early marriage days when we had so little money that every single grocery list was carefully orchestrated to the cent. We were both so young and fresh-faced. Mark had a big dream to build his own business, and I wanted to help him see it through. We had hope in abundance. We had potential. We had love. For a long time, that love was our bedrock, our single unifying force. But sometimes, even the strongest foundations can crack if the ground shifts enough. In the beginning, I never intended to be a stay-at-home mom. I'd always pictured myself with a career, possibly in healthcare, going to work in the mornings, wearing scrubs or a lab coat, and coming home in the evenings tired but fulfilled. Then we had the kids. I was overwhelmed in the best possible way. I loved them deeply from the moment they arrived, but I also found myself unexpectedly overwhelmed by how my path had changed shape overnight. Yet necessity can remap your life in ways you never imagined. Mark was trying to build his contracting business from the ground up. It demanded every ounce of time and energy he had. I'll admit, I was proud of him. I admired his grit and resilience. I remember the nights he'd come home late, drywall dust in his hair, sawdust on his clothes, exhausted but excited to show me the new ideas he had for drumming up clients. He'd talk about expansions, marketing strategies, and eventually how he wanted to hire a small crew and remove some of the burden from his own shoulders. "This is our ticket, Rach," he would say, using that nickname that nobody else ever used. "This is how we build something for our family." It was true that his business was our life. It was also the reason it made sense for me to step back from work altogether and devote myself to the house and kids. We wanted them homeschooled, at first purely because it was convenient, but eventually we both agreed that homeschooling had perks we came to really love. We could tailor the pace, let our kids chase what interested them, keep them close while they were little. At least, that's what I told myself, focusing on the positives to avoid thinking about all the ways I felt trapped. Early on, I did all the normal stay-at-home mom stuff, preparing lunches and dinners, handling the laundry, balancing the checkbook, paying the bills, walking the dog, cleaning baseboards, vacuuming, grocery shopping, scrubbing the toilets, scheduling appointments, you name it. In my more resentful moments, I sometimes felt I was single-handedly running a small empire of tasks. Meanwhile, Mark was gone from 6 in the morning until well after the kids were in bed, at least in those early years. And on the weekends, if a job ran behind or if a client needed more hands, he'd volunteer himself again. "Because it's my dream, I can't fail," he'd say apologetically. But I understood, or tried to. This was our shared ambition, or so I believed. Still, I loved him, and I believed in him. I saw those qualities of passion and perseverance, things I still admire to this day, and I knew that if we put in the time, eventually we'd see some semblance of success. I was also practical enough to know it wasn't going to be easy. A marriage is a marathon, not a sprint, my mother always said. She adored Mark and saw him as a diamond in the rough. "He works so hard," she would sigh in that proud, motherly tone. Sometimes she'd gently place her hand on mine and say, "But keep some energy for yourself, child. Don't forget you're a person, too." I tried to heed that advice, but it's tough when your entire daily schedule revolves around tiny humans who need you for everything from tying their shoes to teaching them multiplication. In the midst of it, though, I had purpose. If I felt lonely or bored or resentful, I stuffed it down. And if some nights I lay in bed wide-eyed, wishing I had some kind of personal outlet or career milestone to aim for, I reminded myself that the biggest purpose in my life was these children, and that Mark and I were a team. Over time, the business stabilized. Mark's hours were still long, but not as bone-crushingly exhausting for him. We had enough staff that Mark could manage more and physically work less. He got home before the kids went to bed sometimes. We even took a few weekend getaways as a family. The payoffs for all those years of single-minded focus were finally rolling in. That should have been the moment I felt the biggest relief, right? Yet, ironically, it was the moment when I started feeling a deep, throbbing restlessness. Our kids were older. We'd actually done well with homeschooling, so they were becoming more and more autonomous. They worked on their lessons at the kitchen table, and I'd only pop over to check on them or help when necessary. That gave me hours a day of free time that, in the past, was swallowed up by the chaos of toddlerhood. And in that new free space, a yearning started. I thought, what about me? What do I want to do now that I'm no longer fighting for every spare second? So I decided, with Mark's agreement, that I'd go back to school. I had a handful of college credits from my late teens I could transfer, so I enrolled at a community college to earn my associate's degree, with the eventual goal of nursing school. As long as I could remember, I'd been fascinated by healthcare. I loved the idea of making a tangible difference in someone's most vulnerable moments. So I took the plunge. Going back to school changed a lot in me. I was in classes with people from every walk of life, some older, some younger, some fresh out of high school, others returning to education in midlife. I made friends, classmates in labs, people who studied alongside me in the library, or folks I'd chat with in the cafeteria as we scarfed down cheap sandwiches and worried about finals. It felt exhilarating to be among peers and to talk about things unrelated to homeschool, or whether the sink was clogged, or what Mark needed me to do for the business. Suddenly, I was discussing patient care procedures, reading about anatomy, dipping my toes into volunteering opportunities at local clinics. My mind was buzzing with possibility, and for the first time in a long while, I remembered that I was not just a mother or just a wife, but also a person with her own drive and spark. Mark seemed supportive, at least in the early phases. He said, "I think it's great you want to do this. We can handle the homeschooling. The kids are older anyway. I can pitch in when I can." I felt a surge of gratitude. It genuinely meant a lot to me that he was proud of what I was doing. I used to text him photos of me studying at the school library, or of some new scrubs I tried on for labs. He would respond with something like, "Nice," or "You got this." It was never deeply effusive, but then again, he's never been the type to wear his emotions on his sleeve. However, once I started the actual nursing program, everything kicked up in intensity. The structure of nursing school is famously rigorous: clinical hours, labs, classes, and enormous amounts of reading. It devoured my time in ways that made my previous classes look easy. Add to that the volunteering I'd gotten involved with, and suddenly, I found myself away from home significantly more often. Looking back, I realize I should have had more thorough discussions with Mark about how drastically our dynamic was about to shift. We both recognized it was going to be harder, but perhaps neither of us realized how much harder it would be. Almost overnight, all those little chores that I used to do without thinking began to fall on, at least on the days I was on campus or at the hospital. Making sure the kids actually did their assignments, grocery shopping, bedtime routines, laundry, it was all waiting for him when he walked in from work. And I started noticing that he didn't handle it with the patience and acceptance I'd had for so many years. Snide comments came first. Something like, "Oh, I guess the laundry just does itself now," or "I didn't realize the kids' schedules were so complicated." At first, I would jokingly laugh them off, a little offended, but assuming he just needed time to adjust. "Thank you for folding those towels, I appreciate it," I'd respond, adding an extra hug, hoping it would quell the tension. But over time, those comments got more frequent. They were no longer jokes, but rather sharp little barbs with actual resentment behind them. I tried to talk to him about it on several occasions. Late at night when the house was quiet, I'd find him in the living room, staring at some sports recap on TV, flipping channels with a blank look in his eyes. I'd take a seat beside him and quietly say, "Mark, can we talk about this shift we're going through? I know it's a big change. How can we make it easier?" But every single time he'd shrug, offer a short grunt of, "I'm fine," or "It's nothing," and that was that. Sometimes I'd hear frustration in his voice, a telltale edge that told me it wasn't nothing. But if I pressed, he'd get up and find some reason to walk away. So I started letting him have his space, not wanting to push him in a way that might escalate the tension. I see now that this was a mistake. We needed to talk, but we never fully did. We let resentment fester in a sealed jar. Meanwhile, my independence grew. For years, I had clung to Mark, partly out of love and partly out of fear. I'd had some severe postpartum depression following the birth of my second child, and those memories still stung. That was the era when I couldn't bring myself to walk into a grocery store alone. Mark often had to hold my, figuratively and literally, guiding me toward normalcy. Even after I started healing, I had this lingering sense that I needed him with me to face the world. But that had been changing steadily over the last 5 years. Therapy, personal growth, and maybe just maturity. I was finally comfortable in my own skin. I found new friends in nursing school. They were vibrant, driven people who also needed stress relief from the intense program. We started going out for quick dinners after a late lab, or meeting for a movie if we had a free night. For the first time, I had a small social circle completely separate from Mark. It was one of the most empowering experiences I'd had in a decade. Suddenly, I had inside jokes that belonged only to me, experiences that were mine alone. It fed my soul. Mark's reaction to this was a brand of jealousy I didn't quite recognize. At first, it was mild. He'd ask me if these friends were single or if they were men or women. He'd lightly tease, "So, you've got a bunch of younger classmates? I guess you're the mother hen, huh?" I'd laugh it off. But soon his attitude became darker. Whenever I came home, if I had that extra spark in my eyes from a genuinely fun evening, he'd go ice cold. Sometimes he wouldn't speak to me for hours. Other times he'd lay into me with accusations or demands that I show him the texts on my phone. This was new territory for me, for us. We'd always trusted each other, and I was not doing anything that should raise suspicion. Still, he seemed convinced I was out gallivanting with these people, ignoring my family. He'd grumble things like, "You don't even care about us anymore," or "All you do is run around with your friends." The irony? I was still home most nights, and any outings were maybe once a week, if that. When you factor in my volunteer hours plus actual paid work during the summer, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., a few days a week, my schedule was tight, but I wasn't partying every night, or ignoring the kids, or refusing to help with anything. It was just that my available time had shrunk, and Mark felt the absence keen. The confrontations escalated. He would yell, call me names, spew the kind of hurtful remarks I'd never heard from him before. It was as though his frustration at our evolving situation and his fear of losing me twisted together into something bitter. I'd get home from volunteering around 9 in the evening, and the moment I stepped in, I'd feel the tension crackling like static in the air. He'd appear in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, practically shaking with anger. I remember one particular night when I came home from a short movie date with two of my best classmates. The second I turned the key in the lock, I heard him shout from the other room, "What the hell time do you call this?" I was stunned. It wasn't even midnight. It was maybe 10:30. I'd texted him ahead of time that the movie might run late. But that small courtesy seemed to infuriate him more, as if my needing to text him was proof that I was doing something wrong. That night, he searched my phone while I was in the shower. I'd left it on the nightstand, and when I came out, I found him standing there with the screen unlocked, scrolling through my messages. He barked, "What are you hiding?" over and over. I grabbed the phone, heart pounding. "Nothing," I insisted, and it was the truth. There was nothing incriminating to find. But he glared at me, suspicious. "We'll see," he muttered, tossing my phone onto the bed. I felt a chill in my body, a memory of a previous, abusive relationship I'd endured in my teenage years. That sense of constantly walking on eggshells, always bracing for the next blow-up, it was creeping back in. Yet, I still told myself, he's not an abuser, he's just upset. This is stress. He's a good man at heart. I repeated that like a mantra. And it's true that Mark wasn't physically violent. He was a good man in many ways, a loyal friend, a supportive partner for so long, a devoted father to our kids. But when someone's actions leave you in fear, when you feel the need to tiptoe around them, offering placating smiles so they don't snap, that's a flashing red alarm. Sometimes, verbal aggressiveness can damage you as badly as a slap. The words whittle away at your self-esteem, your sense of safety, your confidence. And soon, I found myself in precisely that place, my self-esteem crumpling, that sense of personal empowerment draining away, replaced by shame and confusion. I tried to fix it. I tried to go over the issues calmly, tried to point out that I was still home the vast majority of nights, that the kids were still well taken care of, that I was simply forging an identity in nursing school. "I'm the same person, Mark, just growing," I'd say. But that growth apparently felt threatening to him. He never explicitly said, "I don't like your new independence," but every cutting remark, every silent treatment, every angry outburst signaled that that was precisely how he felt. And eventually, I felt beaten down enough that I questioned if it was worth it. But how could I throw away 16 years of marriage? We had children together. We built a life. We had real love. He was the man who once wrote me a poem on our anniversary, who planned a picnic in the back of his old pickup truck under the stars, who held me through postpartum depression when everything was dark. I didn't want to lose that. I didn't want to become a statistic or break our children's hearts. And from a practical standpoint, I wasn't sure how we'd navigate separate living situations. How would custody? What about the kids' schooling? The business finances? The thought of walking away felt like stepping into a swirling black void. And then, ironically, it was Mark himself who started pushing us ever closer to that precipice with each new verbal attack. He was wearing me down. I would cry in private, sometimes in the car before going into my volunteer shift. I'd hold the steering wheel, tears rolling down my cheeks, thinking, is this it? Is this who we are now? One pivotal night stands out. I'd volunteered at a local clinic, helping to run a simple pop-up health screening event. We ended around 7 p.m., and everyone decided to grab a quick dinner at a cheap burger joint nearby. I texted Mark, "Hey, done volunteering, going to get a bite? I'll be home by 9-ish. Kids already ate the leftovers, right?" He didn't reply. I figured maybe he was busy or driving. I went to dinner, though I felt uneasy. The conversation around me was lively. We joked about test anxiety, teased each other about mispronouncing medical terms, debated which shifts to sign up for next semester. I tried to laugh and enjoy it, but the dread in my stomach took away my appetite. By 8:30, I pulled into our driveway. The house was dark. I stepped inside to find Mark sitting in the living room with the lights off, the TV glowing in front of him. Our kids were already in bed. My "hey, I'm home" went unanswered. He glanced at me, turned back to the TV, and abruptly turned the volume. I made my way to the couch and sat down, leaving a gap between us. "Are you upset with me?" I asked quietly. He didn't move his eyes from the screen. "What do you think?" he said. His voice was cold, foreign. We ended up in a scalding argument that lasted over an hour. Or maybe it was just him shouting and me choking back tears. He demanded to know exactly what we'd been doing at dinner, who had come along, why I needed to be there. "You're a wife and a mom. Volunteering is one thing, but do you really have to go out with them afterward? Don't you realize you have a family at home who needs you?" Over and over he told me I was selfish, that I was chasing some fantasy of being young and single again. At one point, he called me a word I'd never heard him use. "You're acting like a real brat." I know that word doesn't sound earth-shattering, but the venom behind it was. He may as well have slapped me. When he finally stormed off, I sat there in the dark, tears streaming down my cheeks, feeling the bruised remnants of my self-esteem throbbing painfully. That was the first time I truly wondered if this was the end. Could I keep living under these conditions, always waiting for him to explode, always feeling guilty for wanting a life outside the house? I'd promised him forever, and I'd always taken that vow to heart. But I wasn't sure how we'd survive if he insisted on tearing me down every time I tried to stand on my own 2 feet. I tried to salvage it by suggesting couples counseling. "We need help," I said, showing him a list of local therapists. "I can't do this alone, and we can't fix something so complex by ourselves." But he resisted, shutting down the conversation immediately. "Counseling's a waste of time," he grunted, stalking out of the room. It was like he was in denial that we were even having a real problem. Or maybe he knew we did, but refused to face it. I kept going to individual therapy, though, determined to protect my mental health. My counselor gently guided me to reflect on how Mark's behavior was affecting me. Every session, I'd make anxious disclaimers. "He's a good guy, I swear. He's just stressed. He's worried." My therapist never told me what to do. Instead, she asked questions. "How do you feel in your home? Do you feel safe? Do you feel respected?" I'd pause, tears hovering, and then slowly shake my head. "No," I'd admit, voice shaking. "I don't." That was the darkest part, realizing the foundations of my marriage might be crumbling. Still, for all the heartbreak and conflict, I wanted to believe we could find our way back. 16 years is a long time. There had to be a path to mutual understanding. But every attempt I made to talk or compromise fizzled. My new habits, volunteering, forging friendships, building my future career, were too important for me to give up, and Mark seemed unable or unwilling to meet me halfway. Finally, about a month after I first posted on that, in the midst of my confusion and despair, I asked him for a separation. I expected it to be the fight to end all fights. Tears, shouting, maybe even a door slammed so hard it cracked the frame. But instead, he just stared at me, then lowered his gaze and said, "Okay, that was it." One word. I think something in him had already recognized how close we were to this cliff. And maybe he was too tired or too proud to beg me to stay. Within days, I found a small, modest apartment. It wasn't anything fancy. 2 bedrooms, a cramped kitchen with outdated cabinets, a living room that echoed because we didn't have much furniture, but it was mine. My name was on the lease. I had my own key. I remember the first night I slept there, how strange it felt to be alone. The kids were with me that night, since I decided to alternate custody with Mark on a half-week basis. I tucked them in and they both seemed okay. Kids are resilient in surprising ways. They were mostly excited at the novelty of living somewhere new, though I sensed they also felt a quiet sadness. They didn't fully understand. I told them gently that Mom and Dad needed space and time, but that we both loved them very much. They nodded and accepted the explanation as best they could. A part of me had hoped that moving out would jolt Mark into some kind of epiphany, that it would force him to see how serious the situation was so we could fix it. But that didn't happen. In the first weeks, we had only minimal contact about logistics, like dropping off or picking up the kids, or sorting out a few leftover bills that were still in my name. The walls between us stayed up. If I tried to bring up therapy or suggest a coffee date to talk things through, he would politely say, "No, I'm good," and end the call. It was a heartbreak of a different kind, one that was less about screaming and more about emptiness, a resigned acceptance. Yet, ironically, living separately turned out to be the best thing for both of us. For me, it was undeniable that my sense of self soared. I had the freedom to plan my own schedule without fear of judgment or outbursts. I continued nursing school. I crammed for exams in my own living room, drank too much coffee while flipping through thick textbooks, felt that rush of accomplishment when I started to get a concept. I still had tough days when I'd miss Mark, when I'd replay memories of us slow dancing at our wedding, or the time we took the kids to Disneyland. I'd wonder, couldn't we have tried harder? But overall, it was like emerging from a tunnel into bright sunlight. Freed from that tense environment, I flourished. And to my surprise, so did Mark. Away from me, away from the daily triggers that apparently set him off, he settled into a calmer routine. According to mutual friends, he spent more time with his siblings, joined a local gym, and even started therapy on his own, though he never told me that directly. He also threw himself back into his work, expanding his business further. When we interacted about the kids, he was polite, civil, even respectful. Sometimes we'd share a short laugh over something trivial, like, remember when the kids tried to bake a cake and use salt instead of sugar? And for a brief moment, we were the old Mark and Rachel, smiling together at a memory. Then he'd gather his things and head off, and I'd realize with a pang that the new normal was quietly settling into place. We officially transitioned the kids to public school a few months after I moved out. Homeschooling no longer made sense. We were both working, both had jam-packed schedules, and we didn't want to bounce them between two houses trying to replicate a consistent teaching environment. Surprisingly, they adjusted quickly. They made friends, found new interests, and enjoyed the change. I'd worried so much that a big shift in schooling would be hard on them, but kids can be heartbreakingly adaptable. They seemed happier than they'd been in months. Less tension in the air, no more quiet arguments behind closed doors. It was almost as if they could finally exhale. Despite the heartbreak of separating, I felt a strange weight lift. My counselor called it a sign I was living more authentically, no longer contorting myself to avoid Mark's anger. I continued volunteering, found a part-time job at the local hospital working 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. shifts a few times a week, and I felt an ever-growing sense of pride in balancing all these responsibilities. My finances were still tight, but it felt liberating to handle my own rent, my own bills. Decisions that were wholly mine. And ironically, Mark and I began to get along better once we weren't under the same roof. We had the distance needed to strip away those resentments that had built up like plaque in our marriage. We focused on co-parenting. We texted about parent-teacher conferences, set up times to pick up the kids for dentist appointments, attended a few soccer games together. When we were in the bleachers cheering on our oldest, we actually shared inside jokes about how our kid got all his athletic skill from Mark, because God knows I can't catch a ball to save my life. We'd laugh, genuine, and it struck me how we could still be a team when it came to parenting. There was an echo of the friendship that had once formed the foundation of our romance. I found relief in that. At least we could give the kids a stable environment, even if their parents were no longer together. Weeks turned into months, and soon enough, it became clear that neither of us was looking back. We were both moving forward. We were living completely separate lives, forging a new kind of relationship that revolved around the children's well-being. Our marriage, as it had been, was done. Over time, we officially filed the divorce papers. It was surprisingly smooth, with neither of us fighting for more than was fair. We divided assets, decided on child support, hammered out the visitation schedule. No drawn-out court battles, no vicious attempts at revenge, just two people accepting that their life paths had diverged. That's how I ended up here, in a small but cozy apartment, finishing my nursing program and feeling calmer than I have in years. It wasn't the ending I had once clung to. In my daydreams, I'd pictured Mark at my graduation, giving me a proud hug, maybe wiping away tears of joy, and us returning home to a house full of laughter. Instead, I found a different happy ending. My kids are thriving in public school, making friends, exploring extracurriculars. I'm thriving too, discovering who I am outside the confines of being Mark's wife and the kids' mom. I won't pretend it's been easy. Some nights, I've cried myself to sleep missing the family unity we once had. Sometimes seeing an old family photo pops up on my phone's memories, and it hits me like a punch in the gut. That was real. We had that once. But then I remind myself of all the fights, the coldness, the sense of isolation. That was real too, and living in that toxic environment would have broken me eventually. It wasn't healthy for any of us. Mark and I are friends now, in a cautious but genuine sense. We talk more openly, though we rarely discuss the details of our split. It's almost as though we both acknowledge that it's best left in the past. If the kids have a band concert or a sports event, we'll share rides, exchanging the kids' duffel bags in the parking lot with easy banter. He'll say, "They're growing up too fast," and I'll nod, swallowing a lump in my throat because we both remember when they were tiny. Neither of us regrets the years we shared, but we recognize they've reached their natural conclusion. This isn't the outcome I'd once dreamed of when I made that first post about feeling lost and unsure if I could keep my marriage alive. Back then, I wanted desperately to save it, to bring us back to the closeness we had before. But now, with distance, I see that we had outgrown each other. My world expanded and collided with his fears. He retreated, then attacked, until I was forced to retreat too. Sometimes that's just how relationships evolve, no matter how much you believe in forever. It's not always about blame or villainy. People change. What's most important is that we're all in a healthier place. My kids have two loving parents who, though no longer together, are stable and supportive of each other's roles in their lives. They know that mom and dad aren't at war. They're comfortable asking either of us for help or advice, and we communicate enough to keep them safe, happy, and thriving. And for me, I'm finally becoming the nurse I've always wanted to be. Each day, I learn more about compassion, both for my patients and for myself. I see people in the hospital battling chronic illnesses, struggling with pain, and it reminds me how fleeting life can be. There's a renewed determination in me to live authentic, not trapped in a cycle of fear or resentment. And if I ever find love again, I intend to do so from a place of strength, with no illusions about losing myself. I still get sad sometimes because, no matter how you frame it, a marriage ending is a loss of dreams, hopes, and a particular vision of the future. But I no longer feel that gnawing dread in the pit of my stomach, worried about the next outburst. I don't feel compelled to walk on eggshells. Instead, there's a sense of peace. When I look back on the entire journey, from the timid, depressed young mom who leaned so heavily on her husband, to the newly emboldened woman forging her way in school, to the frightened wife stepping out of a toxic home, I realized just how far I've come. I learned that it's possible to love someone deeply, yet not be able to remain with them, and that sometimes walking away is an act of compassion for everyone involved. I learned that co-parenting can be successful if two people truly put the children first. And above all, I learned that my promise of forever can still be respected in spirit. Mark and I do remain in each other's lives as partners in parenting, if not in marriage. Some promises adapt rather than break. So no, this isn't the fairy tale ending I might have once wanted, where everything reverts back to how it was when we first fell in love. But it's a real ending. An ending that leads to new beginnings for everyone. And in its own way, it's a happy one. My children are thriving, I'm at peace, and Mark is too. We talk without animosity or anger, sometimes even with genuine warmth. It may not be the version of happily ever after we wrote for ourselves at the start, but life is complicated, and stories change. That's what happened. We had a marriage that spanned 16 years, included countless joys and struggles, brought two incredible kids into the world, survived building a business, overcame financial strain, navigated postpartum depression, and eventually ended in separation. Over the course of it all, I found my inner strength. Mark found clarity and space. Our children, who matter most, ended up with two parents who function better apart than they ever did under one roof. And that, to me, is its own kind of blessing. In short, we split, and everything has turned out for the best. We're co-parenting, we're both healthier, and the kids are thriving. It wasn't the ending I expected, but it's an ending that ushered in a bright new chapter for all of us. And if I had to do it all over again, I don't know that I'd change a thing. Because sometimes the path to happiness isn't about going backward or holding on. It's about letting go and stepping forward into the unknown, trusting that it can lead you to a better place.